Hi, I'm Mark Laframboise, and I'm the head buyer at Politics and Prose.
And I'm Lissa Muscatine. I'm a co-owner of Politics and Prose with my husband, Brad Graham. And this is one of the things I look forward to most each year, is getting together with Mark, who has read more than any human being on the face of the earth. And we spend a lot of time during the year just comparing notes and trading suggestions. So it's really, really fun to do this with him. Listen carefully to what he says, because he really is the best book buyer in America. And we are lucky to have him at P&P. And we have a kind of an interesting list. I should just say that we don't just recommend bestsellers, although there are going to be a couple of books here that will be recognizable that have gotten a lot of attention that we just have to mention them because they're that good. But sometimes we also try to highlight some books that maybe we hope you'll pay more attention to, and that hope will find their way into the bookshelves and nightstands of many of you. So that's what we have in mind. And thank you so much for joining us. Mark, do you want to start?
Yeah, I wanted to talk about Luster by Raven Leilani, because it's a book that we both read and we both loved, and it was on the top of both of our lists. And it's a debut novel. It doesn't feel like one because the prose is so, the story, I should say, not the prose, the story itself is so authoritative that you don't feel like you're in the hands of a novice by any means. But what's remarkable is that it's just so damn funny. You know, this character that she has created. She's a young African-American woman who's having an affair with a middle-aged white guy. And it really takes off when she befriends the man's wife and daughter. And it's just this ridiculous dynamic that just feels completely natural within the confines of the text that you're reading. Her insight into just the way the world works, and the way that she even critiques herself, as well as everybody around her, of course, is smart and absolutely hilarious.
Yeah, I think what I've also really liked about the novel, and it's, Leilani, the author, is quite young. I think she's still in her maybe mid-20s, right? Or not much older than that. And yet, the protagonist, in other hands, could have been a young woman who you feel is being exploited. And there are moments of that, but she gives a lot of agency and control to this protagonist, who is dealing with these older people who are white, who kind of just, she clearly has a much more nuanced understanding of the world. And so it's actually a really, in some ways, a novel of empowerment, I thought. And it's just an incredibly refreshing, original novel. So Mark, you're always heavy on fiction, which I love. That's why I go to you for advice so often. I think you've read more fiction this year than I have. What other novels do you have on your list that people should know about?
One book I love that needs more attention because it's not getting enough love is Aimee Bender's The Butterfly Lampshade. And she's primarily known for her short story collections and, publishing short stories in the New Yorker and everywhere else. But Butterfly Lampshade is a story about the 8-year-old daughter of this woman who is institutionalized. She's completely lost it and in public, and she's being committed to an institution. And she's a single mom, so that leaves the daughter somewhat orphaned, but she's put in care of one of her teachers, who's going to care for her until she can unite them with her aunt and uncle, who have agreed to take her in. And it's just a beautifully told story that it's kind of questioning its own reality all the way across the story. And it's just a surprisingly fresh take on this whole novel business.
That sounds, I haven't read it yet. I'm really looking forward to reading it. What else is on your list?
A book I just finished last night, so I didn't have it on the list of books we're going to talk about, is Leave the World Behind. And a lot of people on staff are reading it, and I see why. It's just a terrific book, and it's about a white family. They're renting somebody's house up in this beautiful neighborhood, and while they're there, something has happened, but we don't know what. And the owners of the house is this older black couple. They come back and say, "Hey, we're sorry, this is an emergency, but this is our house." And they kind of look at him with disbelief, but they end up all kind of getting together. And then things start going really bad. There's a loud cracking sound in the sky. And all of the animals, the deer and everything, are all kind of going on this great migration, like they know some physical tragedy is about to happen. And all the while, everybody's aware that something tragic has happened. But because the power is down, the internet is down, all of the communications are down, they don't know what. They don't know if it's been a war or a hurricane or some kind of natural disaster. And they figure out how to do it together. And there's no happy ending here. We're just watching them slide toward their inevitable dissolution. And it's crazy because you really do love these characters, and you love how this older Black couple and this younger white family have created these bonds with each other and are so reliant on one another. But you know, it's not going to end well.
I want to just mention two books that I think are great escapist books for the pandemic. For those of you who love mysteries, one is called His and Hers. It's by Alice Feeney. Actually, both of the authors in this case are British. Alice Feeney worked at the BBC for, many years. And the protagonists and main characters in this book, one is a presenter at the BBC, one is a cameraman from the BBC. And it takes place not so much in London, but in a country town where this woman protagonist grew up. And there's a series of untoward events, the disappearance and murders of a number of women who all have these past connections. And so the book is really, it's a whodunit. It's a psychological thriller. There are a few tiny shreds of graphic ickiness in it. But it's really suspenseful. It's beautifully told. It's a terrific mystery. It's a real escapist book. I highly recommend it. The other one that I love is Lucy Foley's new book called The Guest List. She wrote a book a few years ago called The Hunting Party, and it takes a similar format. She tells the story of a mystery. Something has happened in both of these books, but The Guest List is set on an island off the coast of Ireland. It's during a wedding. And so what you have is the trying to resolve what happened and who did it. Through the voices of all the main characters and how they see it. And it's a very effective technique in the hands of somebody as skilled as Lucy Foley. It's very suspenseful, also a psychological thriller, nothing too violent or gory about it. And another perfect mystery for this time of year and this moment of crisis when everybody's wishing they could do something and not think about what else is going on in the world. So I love those two mysteries.
What Are You Going Through by Sigrid Nunez. Those of you who read The Friend, which won the National Book Award a couple of years ago, she can write about nothing. You know, The Friend was about a woman who inherited a Great Dane after her friend died. And in this case, she kind of does that too. The main character in this book, she's an ex-wife of a professor, and everything is just her reacting to other people until at some point, a friend that she had known in college wants her to help her and be witness to her taking her own life because she has just gotten a cancer diagnosis. And I won't tell you what happens at the end because it doesn't really even matter. It's just the telling of the story surpasses kind of the plot elements of the story, which is always the case in her books. You know, she could write the instructions to how to make coffee in a electric coffee maker, and it would be really, really interesting because that's just the way that she is as a writer. So in this case, there is something compelling. There are life and death issues involved, and beautiful recognitions of character. I think it's a remarkable book. I just can't wait to read whatever she writes next.
You know, Mark, speaking of just development of great, memorable characters and sort of the nuances of character at following a plot line of a book, two of my two favorite novels of this year, Deacon King Kong by James McBride, his latest novel, which is just a masterpiece. First of all, it's just the most charming, but also deep, provocative book. But his characters have such charm. His dialogue is phenomenal. And this protagonist in this book is a guy who lives in the House of Refuge, older, and he has this role in crossing boundaries of people in New York City and generations. And And McBride is just so good at drawing the reader in and making you feel like you get to know these characters. And the characters are all flawed. They all have issues, for lack of a better term, and yet they're all so sympathetic. And so you're very drawn into the story. The story then evolves, and you start seeing the deeper meanings in it. So I'm not going to talk too much more about Deacon King Kong, because it has gotten a huge amount of very deserved attention. And James McBride, of course, is just such a master storyteller. The other is the second book by the young writer, Brit Bennett. Her first book, The Mothers, came out a few years ago to great acclaim, her debut novel. Often second novels are not that good, right? I mean, second books often don't rise to the occasion. That is not the case here. The Vanishing Half, which is Brit Bennett's new book, is phenomenal. It's one of the best novels I've read in a while. It's the story of these two young African-American women who grew up in rural Louisiana, and they're very light-skinned. They're from a community of light-skinned African-Americans, and they split up at one point, and one of them goes off and sort of basically passes for white. They're reunited at the end. I won't say more than that. It's a really a masterful exploration of identity, not just race, gender. It has other subtexts about sexual preference, sexual identity, generational, geographical boundaries. And I'm so impressed with this young writer. I think, again, she may not even be 30 yet, and she's just a superstar talent.
I wanted to use this to take opportunity to talk about Utopia Avenue by David Mitchell. Anything David Mitchell writes, again, some people are just your favorite writers, and whatever they write, you're going to read. Utopia Avenue is certainly that, but it's worth every moment you spend with it. It's a rock and roll book from the late 60s, early 70s, and it's this fictional band called Utopia Avenue, which, but what's cool is that you know how big they are because of who they run around with. They hang out at Janis Joplin's apartment in New York. They hang out at the Chelsea Hotel, and all of these people do walk-ons. There's cameos, and so it's just a really fun book to hang out with, and you're never surprised when some other like rock god, all of a sudden he's having a conversation with Mick Jagger, or he's talking with Peter Townsend. It's that kind of a book. It's the reality that he kind of puts you into. So it's really cool. Anybody who really loves music from that time will immediately enjoy this book, just because it's so intelligently told, and because it's got all these people that you absolutely revere as musicians too. So that was what's cool about it.
I have a book about music to recommend, not a novel, but one of my very, very favorite books of recent memory, because it is so elegant and so beautifully written and so charming, is a book called Chasing Chopin.
All right.
And it's by a woman named Annik Lafarge, who is kind of a critic, social critic, art critic, architecture critic. And she has written this wonderful book. It really, I read it in Galley before it came out, and I loved it from the first pages. I am not a classical music aficionado. I know very little about Chopin. It doesn't matter. You don't have to love classical music. You don't even have to have heard any of Chopin's pieces to find this book so engaging. And what she really does is begin with a story of her own, which is that she has always been interested in the piano, and she decides to take the piano on fairly seriously about 20 plus years ago. And from that, she is determined to play Chopin, and which is very difficult. And so this is the story of her journey discovering Chopin, but also learning about Chopin's impact on modern music of today, on popular culture of today, his influence across, historical periods of tumult in Europe. It talks about his relationship with George Sand. It talks about the history of the piano, how the piano technologically changed during Chopin's life, and how Chopin used the technological changes in his compositions. It's just a fascinating cultural study and so beautifully done. And it's not long. She manages to do this in 150 or some pages. I really highly, highly recommend it to everyone who has any remote interest in music or Chopin or history. Terrific book. And I have a couple other, the nonfiction that I would recommend this year is sort of varied. And again, I'm not going to recommend certain books that have gotten a lot of attention. One that has gotten a lot of attention and that I am going to recommend because I really think everybody should read it is Memorial Drive by the former poet laureate Natasha Trethewey. This is a magnificent book. It sounds like a downer. It's really not. It's really a book about discovery and about acknowledging one's past, facing one's past, understanding one's past, and then growing from that experience. So Natasha Trethewey, she grew up in Atlanta. And when she was a young woman, I think still in college, her mother was murdered by her second husband, who had been a domestic abuser. And Natasha Trethewey moves away from Atlanta and is a poet and a writer and a professor, and really never wants to go back and never wants to confront the location where this happened, her mother's home. And so, but she does eventually go back, and that is what propels her to write this memoir. And she goes back and she really gets into the forces at work that led to this incident, and also her own attempts to kind of bury it, to escape from it, and then to kind of reclaim it and sort of create her own more understanding narrative around it. It is tremendous. She's obviously a phenomenal writer. Again, there are subtexts of race, class, gender, violence in it. And so at the end, you really feel the power of Natasha Trethewey basically reclaiming this story. It's a magnificent book.
Awesome. It doesn't really need any help, any hype because of who she is, but I just wanted to throw some love at Jack by Marilynne Robinson. I love Marilynne Robinson. I think she's the smartest person on the earth. And when she talks, she just talks way over my head, and I just understand as little as I can and still get so much from her. But Jack, it tells a story of a person who was mentioned in the previous 3 Gilead novels, but whose life had never been explored. He's kind of the black sheep of the family. He's the son of the Reverend John Gladney. And but Jack we know that when he shows up in the Gilead novels, he's married to an African-American woman, which this is in the early 1960s in the middle of the country. And so they're kind of treated as pariah. But here we learn how they came together, how they fell in love with each other, the difficulties that they had in that terms. And I think that at that point, when we meet them, though, fittingly, they meet in the dark. They meet in the deep dark in a cemetery after the cemetery is closed and they're locked inside. So maybe they know what each other's race is, but maybe not, because it's kind of the point is that they are completely in the dark. And that's almost like the first third of the novel is this one scene, this one long conversation that they have in the cemetery. And but he is an alcoholic, a draft dodger. He is living on the fringes of respectability. And his relationship with her makes him want to be a better man. I know that's maybe a cliche, but thrown in with the kind of the wild card of the racial thing, it becomes really, really compelling. And he doesn't succeed most of the time. He fails most of the time. But you can see where the effort is coming from, and you can see where the love is in this book. And that's what's compelling. Anytime I think you see a very, very truthful and genuine rendering of love in the space of a story, it can really just kind of rock your world. And I think she does that in a big way in this book.
Yeah, she is one of the most brilliant people on the planet, I think. I do want to mention a book. It's an incredibly ambitious, brilliant book called Black Wave which is by Kim Ghattas, who is the longtime BBC correspondent in Washington, and she's covered the Middle East. She's Lebanese born. She's lived in various parts of the world. She's really somebody who herself, throughout her career, has crossed all different kinds of boundaries and reported about crossing those boundaries and what those boundaries represent. And she took on the Herculean task of deciding to try to explain major events in the Middle East of the last 40 years, seen through the prism of the Saudi Arabia-Iranian relationship. And it is an incredible book. It is not just political, not just historical, not just about religion, not just about culture. It combines all of these things in the most holistic way. It deals with cultural influences. It deals with all the many factors that come to bear and how these two countries become so central to almost everything that's happened in the Middle East, in some ways that you wouldn't know even if you're a follower of the Middle East. And she's a wonderful writer. She's a great storyteller. This book was a Financial Times top 20 book of 2020. The New York Times just put it on their top 100 books of 2020. So I'm not alone in singing its praises. But for anybody who really wants to understand the subtexts of the Middle East, this is and the kind of driving forces, this is a book that is a must read. The other one that I really like that, I wish everybody would read, and came out, at the end of a lot of discussions about race in our country, Black Lives Matter, George Floyd. Wes Moore, who wrote two really good previous books, one was Moore, and then the next one was a sequel to that, which was sort of his life growing up in Baltimore and sort of finding his way and becoming this superstar. He's now the head of the Robin Hood Foundation in New York. He's on MSNBC. You've probably seen him on these shows quite often doing commentary. But he's from Baltimore. And he went back and he has a book called 5 Days. And essentially, he looks at 8 different people in Baltimore who were impacted by or connected somehow to the events surrounding the death of Freddie Gray. And he starts with the moment that Freddie Gray is picked up on the streets of Baltimore and thrown into that van, and to the 5 days later when he dies in a hospital in Baltimore. And this is the most poignant book about what this man, Freddie Gray's life was and wasn't, and how this city responded to what was going on with him. And sort of this one man who's so anonymous, who got such a horrible disadvantaged start in life, growing up in a lead-infested apartment building and so, in the lowest rung of poverty. And then he becomes almost iconic, ironically, through his own death.
Right.
And in Wes's hands, Wes is also a terrific storyteller. He's an incredibly humane and compassionate, brilliant man. And it's just a really, really good look at how one event can both galvanize, but also, create, expose the tensions within an entire community. Really, really like that book.
I'm happy to have the opportunity to mention Red Pill by Hari Kunzru. This is such a weird book. I mean, I think I've said that about 3 books so far. It is weird though. It's about a dude who is a scholar, and he's accepted an invitation to go study at a conference in Wannsee, Germany, and he's studying some very esoteric subject on 18th century poetry and a very, very idiosyncratic kind of field. But when he gets there, the Wannsee conference, if you don't remember Wannsee, why it might sound familiar, because that's where the Nazis dreamed up the final solution, was in the town of Wannsee. And so they're in this institute that's like right across the lake from the house where the final solution was. We watch him slowly, like his mind come apart. When he gets to this conference, he doesn't want to participate in any of the functions that they're doing. He just goes on these long walks, making these weird connections from things to things. And then later he becomes so completely paranoid, but he's so firmly in control of the point of view that we're seeing it through his paranoia. So we don't know what's real and what's not real. We just see him through this very contained third person limited, but so limited that we're singing almost completely through his consciousness, and his world just completely unravels. He ends up, if he can go to some place called nowhere, that's where he is. He's just completely. It sounds like a horrible way to control a narrative, but it's fascinating in the hands of Kunzru. Just to watch, to be in the mind of a mind that's going insane, basically. I just thought it was fantastic. Kind of a virtuoso in terms of self-dissolution.
I'm going to mention one last work of nonfiction, again, very different from the others I've read this year, but I think it's a good one for the pandemic in the sense that I don't know if all of you are like me, but I have found that during the pandemic, I have been yearning even more for deeper connections to my friends and family. I think we're all wanting that kind of emotional nourishment that's much harder to get when you're isolated and, often, at home and not socializing as much as usual. So a book came out this year called Big Friendship. It's gotten a lot of attention, written by two young women, Aminatou and Friedman. Well known because they have a podcast called Call Your Girlfriend, which has zillions of followers. Anyway, they wrote this book called Big Friendship. It's about their friendship. They got to know each other in Washington, D.C. as young millennials, single women who'd come to Washington for similar reasons to be involved in politics and government journalism and that sort of thing. And they became incredibly close friends. And they described the emotional bonds they created. And this really is a book about the possibility of emotional intimacy with friends, not romantic relationship, but deep emotional connections with people that you love deeply. And in this case, it's these two women. And it tells the story of this friendship and then the pressures that come to bear on it and how they respond to that. And then, of course, they decide to do this podcast. So now they become almost a brand. They become a business entity, and that creates strains on their friendship. But what I like about the book is it gives people permission to explore friendship and emotional connection in a deep and meaningful way, in an intimate way, beyond the sort of binary, it's either nothing or it's fully romantic. And I think that so many people need to exist in that area in between and are looking for those kinds of connections in between. And this is a book that really kind of describes what that can look like. So I highly recommend that.
I just loved Elena Ferrante's The Lying Life of Adults. One thing I liked about it was because you can read a Elena Ferrante book without having to commit to reading 4 books. This is a standalone, unlike her most famous, My Brilliant Friend. Was it 4 books now? It's 4 books.
Yeah, trilogy that turned into 4.
Yeah, a trilogy that turned into 4. Yeah. So this is about a young woman in Naples, and we get to know all about Naples. And she's 15, and she's caught up in the emotional turmoil of the adults in her life. Her father and her aunt, his sister, are at war with each other. And she doesn't really even permit it to know her aunt until later on. And when she does meet her, she realizes how much life this person has and how different she is from her own father and how they've been feeding her lies for her entire life. And it's her ability to cut through these lies. There's also some point later on when she's in this relationship with a woman who's her friend and also this woman's fiance. And she has this opportunity to maybe betray her friend and act out her desires with this man who's her fiance, who's the most charming, intelligent person she's ever met in her life. And you realize that she realizes that to be an adult is to lie. All of a sudden, she's put in a position where she has to lie. And I think that doing that, I think she learns so much about the other adults that she's been growing up with, because to be an adult is to sometimes have to tell non-truth. And she does learn that. But mostly what's compelling about the novel is just the way she characterizes this young woman and the world that she's in and the contrasts of one part of Naples to another part of Naples, which I didn't know anything about anything, but it's the difference between respectability and wildness, or the conformity and imagination of these two places. And the more, the more impoverished people are, the more, in this book at least, have the most heart and the most life going on. And I just thought it was a remarkable story. I loved her. And even in translation, this book just sings. It's just amazing. Homeland Elegies by Akhtar. Akhtar. This is another one of those books that the main character's name might as well be Akhtar, because he's really telling his own story. It's a story about a Muslim man who's written a play that's very famous, but also very kind of scandalous, which is Akhtar. And it's him going through, it's mostly the relationship between him and his father. His father's claim to fame is that he once did a medical procedure on Donald Trump. And now he considers himself part of the Trump family because he was a consulting physician on a case of his. And of course, the son makes the most of that, for sure. But it's a powerful exploration of what it is to be a Muslim artist in this time. And in his case, to be a Muslim playwright in this time. There are things that you can draw completely to his life to mark it as an autobiographical novel, where sometimes they were calling these autofictions these days. But then there's these other parts of his life where you wonder, I hope this part is made up. I hope this didn't really happen to him. But you don't know. So he's kind of in the line of a lot of contemporary novelists, straddling the fence between fiction and nonfiction, and using fiction when it's convenient, using his own life when it's most convenient, because that's what he knows best, probably. And you can see why it's getting so much acclaim. It's gotten a lot of acclaim, and very well deserved. And that was my takeaway from Homeland Elegies.
So this is as usual, our motto is so many books, so little time, and 2020 is no exception. There are far more titles I think both of us could be recommending. Like I said at the outset, this is meant to be a list that has some books and titles people have probably heard of and maybe read reviews of, and others that hopefully will be added to your list of things you want to read, because they haven't gotten the kind of attention they deserve. So we hope that you will find a lot to enjoy in this list of fiction, nonfiction, different kinds of fiction, different kinds of nonfiction. Obviously, I think reading now is one of the best ways to retain your humanity and to get through this crisis that we're all in. We really appreciate all of you supporting Politics and Prose. It's been a very tough time for retail businesses like ours. We are so heartened that our community is so supportive, that people continue to look to books for guidance, for diversion, for entertainment, for inspiration, for education, for all those things. Mark, thanks for doing this again. It's like an annual event, and we will be back here doing it again next year. So thank you.
Maybe in the same room.
Maybe in the same room. That would be nice.
Yeah. Anyway, it's always fun to talk to you, Lissa, and it's always fun to do this little video project. So happy holidays to anybody who's watching.
Happy holidays to you all.